Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started now. This is 10 things you need to know before you start your budget, being brought to you by US Analytics. As we go along, if you do have questions, please ask them. But if you're not speaking, I ask that everyone remain on mute. And as we are getting started here, there may be a few other folks joining us. We're going to play a little game. So if you do know the answer, please speak up. So we're going to play a quick little ocean animals guessing game. This should be a pretty easy one, I think. So what am I? I can be found in water and on land. Some of my kind can walk sideways. If I lose a leg, I might grow it back. And I can be eaten or even kept as a pet. And I recommend not both at the same time. Anyone? Anyone want to take a guess?
A crab.
A crab. That is correct. You are a crab, or this individual is a crab, and there's our friendly little crab right there. She'll come back to visit us a little bit later. Okay, excellent. I'm feared by many people. I can detect blood from miles away, and I have rows of sharp teeth. Anyone? Oh, I gave it away. My mistake. I clicked too soon on the slide there. But yeah, that would be a shark. Okay, we're going to now dive into the rest of this now. Being that this is summer, we're trying to follow a beach theme. Where I think a lot of folks would prefer to be there, maybe. So we're gonna try to keep this a little bit lighter today. So the first bit of advice I have, the first of the 10 things that I would recommend that you need to know before you start a budget, and these are based these 10 recommendations or 10 things to think about, 10 things you need to know, are really based on my experience. So my name is Bill Lowry. I'm the president and chief solution architect of US Analytics, and I've been in this business for about 27 years now, and I've been heavily involved in the Oracle EPM products, Oracle planning and budgeting in particular, used to be called PBCS or Hyperion planning. Did a lot of customized planning solutions and budgeting solutions prior to that. So I've been in this space, particularly in the planning and budgeting space, for about 24, 25 of those 27 years. Started out, a little bit more technical, but I've been advising companies for at least the last 23 years on not just tools, but also sort of best practices in terms of the budget. And these are really things that I've kind of learned over time, mistakes I've seen clients make, or just things that I've picked up as kind of good practices to follow, particularly as you're preparing to get ready for your annual budget cycle. So the first one is don't boil the ocean. This is a phrase I've actually used for a long time, so it's just a coincidence that we're using that in this presentation, in our beach theme presentation. But budget season is really intense, right? So you're going to be either asked or tempted to try oftentimes to do a lot of things. And my recommendation is to prepare as best you can, and we'll have a lot of other tips for being well prepared for the budget cycle. But when you start to get requests, don't try to do everything all at once. I've seen a lot of organizations try to implement multiple changes at a time without testing them during their budget cycle. Something comes through where you need to reload data, or maybe somebody else has a request to update a data entry template or form, or change a calculation or something like that. And because you're supporting an intense process, it's got a tight timeline. You may be tempted to just say, "Oh, let's make all these changes, put them in all at once, and move it to production," right? Or worse yet, make the changes in production. I know sometimes that can't be avoided, but I strongly recommend always doing things outside of production first. But the concept of don't boil the ocean is don't try to do too much at once, right? It's to break things down into manageable chunks, simplify things if you can, test, over test, retest, test it again. And if you do need to make changes that are going to have a significant impact, particularly, for example, if you're changing a calculation or even a data entry form or something like that, I always recommend starting small and then kind of working out from there. So maybe if you're changing a calculation, say, and if it is in planning, maybe make the fixed statement on something smaller, an individual month or ideally an individual business unit or department or something like that. The last thing you want to do is roll out a change during the budget cycle that breaks the budget or causes some sort of other additional confusion or bad information to enter into the process. The second recommendation that I have, and I couldn't really think of a good way to phrase this in terms of our beach or ocean theme, but is to consider the difference between precision and accuracy. Precision is being able to replicate the results consistently, right? So, and sometimes to a high level of detail, but you can still be precise and not be accurate. And an example of that is, let's say you want to head to the beach, right? You're going on your beach vacation, and the beach is 50 miles away, but you drive 50 miles in the wrong direction. You've been precise in that you had to drive the 50 miles to get there, and maybe you got the exact same distance going in the opposite direction that you would have needed to get to the beach. You've been very precise, but you've not been accurate. In other words, you're not at the beach, right? You're somewhere else. You're not where you wanted to be. And I list this high in my list of recommendations. And I do these sort of in order of importance to some degree, but not necessarily. But this is something that you'll see in a lot of organizations, particularly certain industries, life science, engineering and manufacturing, and banking and financial services are just some of where people make the assumption that by being more precise, that they're going to get better, more accurate results. And a few examples that I can give, working recently with a life sciences company. This is a company that's actually in the sort of pre-revenue stages of taking pharmaceuticals to market, right? So they're in the research stages and doing clinical trials and stuff like that. They came up with a model that took them months, slowed down their implementation of the software they're going to use to do the budget, and it really slowed down their business processes and point where they were almost paralyzed in terms of being able to move forward with producing a budget. And what they were arguing about was the level of accuracy and how much information was going to be brought into the system to help them predict the cost of their clinical trials, right? And there's a lot of information that goes into it. And if you're not familiar with that space, clinical drug trials have to almost be done on an individual basis because there's so many different factors that go into that. And what was happening though is this kind of this idea of analysis to paralysis, right? Where they're spending so much time because they wanted to have a high level of detail in terms of the information, but they kind of lost sight of the forest for the trees because ultimately when they did go live with the system, they were able to, and they spent a lot of time and and internal resource and a lot of money to get this model to the level of precision that they wanted, but because of outside factors and other things that were happening within the business beyond their control, they weren't able to correctly predict the number of trials they're going to do, right? So they were still way off. They weren't able to accurately predict their clinical trial costs because they couldn't predict the number of clinical trials, not because they weren't, spending so much time on it. But then we were able to demonstrate after the fact. I had the same example happen with a bank, a large bank that I worked with about a dozen years or so ago. They wanted to get down to doing their budget based on individual financial instruments and all the factors and interest rates and volumes and stuff that went with that. And they spent a lot of time and they went way over budget on their system implementation, and they delayed their budget process only to determine that the greater factor in helping them to accurately determine their revenue by these instruments was interest rates, right? So the Fed was making changes to interest rates, and that was having more of an effect than this level of detail. And in both cases, after the fact, we were able to show that if they had used, if they'd done product groupings in the example of the bank, or if they had just looked at a handful of easily measurable factors in the case of the pharmaceutical company, they would have still arrived within about a half a percentage point of where they wanted to be in terms of accuracy. It looks like maybe I was dropped again there. So I don't know where we were. I don't know where I lost you.
Oh, we can hear you.
Okay, excellent, excellent. So I don't know if anybody missed anything, but what I was essentially trying to say is, we talk about being precise, but in many cases, what we're able to do is after the fact, help organizations spending a lot of time, trying to get this tight grouping, right? So if you look at if you look at the slide here, we've got this group of beach balls over here on the right. Those are very precisely grouped, right? We're able to replicate where we're throwing those beach balls each time. But if the target is the hat and glasses over here, these, which are not necessarily as precisely measured, are actually closer to the target, right? So just to keep in mind that spending a lot of time trying to be more precise in your budget modeling does not always yield more accurate results, and sometimes it just costs more money and more time, and eats away at your timeline for completing your budget. Okay, so the next thing is I want to talk about baby crabs, and a term I've used in the past is, you can't necessarily throw more resources at a problem to solve the problem. There's a lot of analogies that can be used for this. Too many cooks in the kitchen, that sort of thing, right? It's all kind of the same concept, but it takes a crab about 4 weeks to hatch her eggs, but you can't get 4 crabs working together to hatch in a week, right? That just doesn't work. So you see the 4 crabs over here on the right side of the slide, they don't have any babies, but this one over here, she has her babies because she spent the time needed to do that. And there's actually, there's a couple of things that this applies to, right? So if you're designing or implementing a new budget process, or you're making tweaks to your process, it doesn't always work to try to shorten the timeline by throwing more resources at it. So if you're trying to do your budget, say in 6 weeks instead of 12 weeks, putting more people on the budget doesn't always work. And from a practical standpoint, if you already have a mature budget process and you're getting ready to start your annual process again, there's a couple of things that I recommend that I've seen that can prevent potential problems, right? And that is with this idea of having, again, too many cooks in the kitchen, or too many crabs trying to make the babies, or trying to hatch the babies. You have sometimes you'll have multiple people assigned either on purpose or inadvertently to security roles where they may overlap. So maybe you have one person who's in charge of a certain geographic region and another person who's in charge of, say, functional departments or functional business units. If they're access to the system, if you have a system, they have access to the system and they overlap, it's possible that they're going to kind of step on each other's toes, right? So one person may be entering or modeling data in the system, another person may go in and make changes, and you don't realize why the numbers are changing. And that's very often the case. So I recommend, as a sort of a best practice or a leading practice, make sure that you have one person that's responsible for each budget unit, whatever that may be. And if your process or your data or your business process doesn't allow for that, then double check, make sure you're double checking security assignments and frequently doing manual checks to make sure that those numbers aren't changing or you're not losing data or something. Because I've seen all sorts of problems happen when you try to get too many people, or sometimes you'll even just have a backup, right? Your organization may say, okay, we're doing our budget during a time when people are going to be out of the office, so we'll assign somebody else to do certain tasks. It's always a good idea to make sure that those folks aren't assigned to do those tasks at the same time, or one person's who may be backing up another isn't accidentally logging in and doing something that they shouldn't be. So just having some manual checks on those processes is always a good idea. Next bit of advice is listen to mom, right? So if we're going to go to the beach, could be mom, could be anybody else, but just as the sort of that kind of stereotypical role, that's the person who's leading the effort. That's the person who's going to make sure you've got your sunscreen, your beach blanket, the snacks, the towel, and drinkable water for you to go out on the beach, so you don't get sunburned, so you don't get dehydrated, and things like that, right? Well, the budget equivalent to listening to mom when you take the kids to the beach is looking at your processes, and I recommend that you do this in advance of starting the budget, right? Give yourself several weeks of preparation time, or at least, several days of intensive preparation time. But one of the things is really look back and look at what was done in the past. And if you weren't around for the last budget cycle, start to ask around ask people who were, get in touch with the folks that have the institutional knowledge. And, mistakes happen. They're great to learn from. Make sure you do learn from your mistakes. Look what happened in the past. Identifying root causes is particularly important. And if you don't have a process in place to look at and identify causes of mistakes as they happen during the budget process, because it's again it's an intensive time where you don't always have time to stop and take do a self-assessment. Try to schedule time immediately afterward when things are fresh in your mind. And if you haven't done that, then at least make an effort. Compare notes of folks that were in the trenches. Try to remember what happened to the best of your ability. Figure out why it happened if you can't remember, or figure out why it happened if you never had time to, and then create a plan for not repeating those mistakes. It's really interesting. Again, I've helped dozens, if not hundreds, of organizations with their budgeting systems and budgets over time. How it's really amazing how many people will repeat the same mistakes over and over again because they simply ran out of time and then didn't take the time after their budget to this. I don't know what's going on. Didn't take time after their budget was done, to really do an analysis of the things that went wrong. So again, and if you have checklists or task lists or things like that, review those with your budget team, with the people that are going to be most heavily involved with doing the budget, and because they might remember things that weren't ever documented, or have suggestions for things that can work more efficiently. The next thing is build the walls first, right? This is just advice for trying to work efficiently and effectively. So the analogy I'm going to use here is, let's say we're going to the beach, we're going to build a sandcastle, right? It's typically easiest to build the walls first. They're simple structures, right? They're usually kind of rectangular. There's not much to them in terms of detail. And they usually are the largest part of the castle that you're going to build, right? No matter how complicated your castle design might be, it might just be 4 walls with turrets. You might design drawbridges and have moats and have all sorts of different buildings and stuff. The walls are the easiest to build, right? So and sort of the purpose of this analogy is to say it keeps dropping me. The purpose of the analogy is to say, do the easiest things first. If you can structure your budget process such that the easy parts, say maybe you've got a very simple revenue model, or there's certain expenses that are easy to calculate, or you just key in by hand or whatever. Do those things first and verify that stuff first. And the reason I suggest that is often people will structure their process sort of so it's sort of anything goes. Don't really look at it, say, by line item or whatever. Maybe push it out to folks that are responsible for entering the revenue and expense information, and you check that when it comes back in. But they may be following different priorities or different processes. And the idea here is that if there are parts of your budget that are easier for everyone to do upfront, try to do those first. This is maybe not always possible, but in situations where it is, because what tends to happen is you'll spend less time on that. This is kind of the 80-20 rule, right? You'll spend less time on that and probably have an impact on more of the numbers than you might think. And then once that's done and verified, it's really just a matter of, do our other changes affect any of those numbers? You can check that or whatever, but really just having the simple stuff done first. When inevitably there are problems to troubleshoot, you're giving yourself more time to troubleshoot other things as they come up, as opposed to having a crunch near the end of the budget where you're trying to validate numbers and troubleshoot calculations and things like that. Again, if you can structure it in such a way that the low-hanging fruit gets addressed first. Okay, now it's time for the beach trip, right? We're going to get our friends together and we're going to take a dive into what's been happening, and we're going to reminisce and catch up. So and what I mean by this is, sit down before the budget season starts with people who have inputs into the budget. This isn't the C-level folks that are setting the targets and stuff like that, right? These are the people you work with day to day when you're doing the budget. Sit down with them. If they're not folks that you're often in touch with, or even if they are, just start asking questions like, hey, talk to your sales managers, your accountants, whoever has inputs, particularly into the drivers that you may have in your budget, right? And depending on your business, it could be any of a number of things, but it could be product folks, manufacturing people, whoever has access to the information that will affect kind of how you start off your budget. It could be economic indicators, it could be rates, it could be volumes or product volumes or manufacturing, volumes and costs and things like that. Sit down with those folks and just kind of, or maybe have get everybody into a room or on a call, but just start to find out sort of what's been going on in the business. So you're likely to have fewer surprises that way, right? Particularly if it's been a while, if you're doing an annual budget and it's been a while, or even if it's a quarterly process, just see if there's anything that's been going on. It doesn't have to be a long meeting, but just say, hey, do we have new products that we need to account for? Are there new, are we changing our rates? Are we doing, something with tiered pricing, or, or have our costs changed and stuff like that? The more you can find out up front, the better off you'll be, and the less surprised you'll be during the crunch time of the budget process. And then spend some time being the lifeguard, right? And what I mean by this is lifeguards are the people that we count on during our beach trip. They're the ones that are sitting up in the tower, kind of looking out over everything, and they're really looking for things that are out of the ordinary, right? Like kids running around or out, splashing around in the water. That's nothing, unusual. But they're looking for the fins in the water, right? That's why we got the shark here. They're looking for the, somebody who's not moving around out in the water and maybe seems to be struggling or whatever. They're looking for the things that are out of the ordinary. And so what I advise is before your budget, again, as part of your preparation, your planning, look at the trends that affect your business, the things that, particularly things that come from the outside, but also things that have happened in the past. And again, if you've gotten your friends together for the beach trip, if you've already talked to the folks who have who have inputs into the budget, and you find out where things are today, you can compare, or what things may be different or things have changed. You can compare that to past trends, and that should give you some idea as to how this might affect your budget. It's always good to know if you're going to have to change a data form or a calculation or something like that ahead of time than to try to do that during the budget cycle itself, right? So the key thing here, I think, is to look for things that have changed, right? If economic trends, market trends, past trends, if things are running pretty much the same as they have been, you're probably just going to update numbers. But if there's something that's fundamentally changing, and you're seeing things that exist today that sort of fall outside of those trends, those are the things to start asking questions about and planning for. An example would be inflation, right? That was a difficult thing that a lot of folks had to account for. And if we think back just a few years, and almost the constant daily changes that happened during COVID and the lockdowns, is businesses were fundamentally trying to figure things out. We had no choice but to deal with those in the moment. But if there are things that you can look at in advance, again, these are the broader business and market trends and things like that, and then try to start planning for how you're going to accommodate those. You'll have more time during the budget season. Scuba lessons. Okay, the next one is it's about training and making sure that folks have the skills, either the new skills or have been refreshed on their skills that they need to effectively and efficiently get through the process. So almost without fail, regardless of whether you're an Oracle EPM user, you have another tool, or you're using spreadsheets, the more often you go between cycles, whether they be reporting cycles or budgeting or forecasting, any kind of planning, whatever, any sort of business cycle, the more people are going to forget, right? That's just human nature and applies to any skills that we have, except for apparently bike riding. But it may seem like there's not a lot to do, particularly if you have your tasks well defined and your forms and your calculations work efficiently and things like that. But the analogy I'm going to use here is, you can go to particularly in the Caribbean, you can go to any resort or whatever, and somebody will put a mask on your face and give you a snorkel and talk to you for 2 minutes and throw you in the water, right? You can go reef diving, but it takes a lot of special training and practice and skill to go scuba diving, right? You have to learn about all the equipment, how to use it, and all the other skills that you need to be able to operate that safely underwater. So the idea here is, don't discount the value of training new employees who may not have been through the cycle before, making sure that your materials are updated, and doing refresher training, right? And then, if possible, practice. And we're going to kind of talk on the next slide here about what does that look like, right? So, and this is kind of like the early bird gets the worm, right? Well, really, the early seagull gets to eat at the beach. And what I mean by that is, now we're getting closer to the time where we're going to actually start the budget process. So we've got to start thinking about, if you're an Oracle EPM customer, you've got to start thinking about things like going in, making sure your test system and your production system are in sync, right? So hopefully you have a process where nothing goes into production without being in test, but sometimes we know those things get out of sync. So it's maybe doing a backup or migrating your production to test, or vice versa. It's updating all the variables. It's doing testing to make sure that all the forms and calculations and reports are getting the results you want. And I think it's really important, I think, and just if possible, get your test system up and running. Help folks get trained, right? If they haven't been trained yet, or do your refresher training, and then have a place for them to go in and practice. Maybe creating have them practice creating the budget, from scratch if possible. Whatever you can do in the test environment before the process starts will pay off dividends. If you can do a walkthrough, an end-to-end walkthrough, that's great. Maybe taking the most recent data, which may not be the final data you need, but anything you can do to make your test environment as real life as possible before the budget process starts and you get folks in and practicing it will result in fewer errors, less confusion, and just more confidence in not only the process, but the data. Okay. The other thing, and I think this is the last one here, that I want to suggest is a highly important set of skills is to plan your beach vacation, right? Run the process, whether it be the budget process, whether it be forecasting process, to the best of your ability. Try to run it like a project if you're not already doing that. And I would say I encounter about maybe a quarter to a third of my clients have done this. And if it's a small organization and you don't have that many steps and dependencies and people working on the budget, it's maybe a little bit less important. But I always recommend treating the budget process or the forecast process or whatever plan you're doing as a project, right? Depending on its complexity, use project management tools. You can use them at a higher level or a more detailed level, but things like Gantt charts, right, to plan out your timeline and who's going to be doing what, and to see dependencies on information and processes and things like that. The more information you can, I don't want you to become beholden to have something that's too detailed to be practical, but I think it really helps to have a clear list of tasks, resource assignments, who's responsible for those tasks, and what the dependencies might be between tasks, right, from sort of beginning to end. And then clearly communicate, it helps you to clearly communicate the timeline, responsibilities, and dependencies, right? So having almost if you're not already doing it, having like a budget kickoff meeting would be very similar to a project kickoff, where you get all the the interested parties together, lay out the timeline, who's going to be responsible for what, and things like that. And I think that you can do that in spreadsheets and stuff, but the more you can utilize even just simple free online tools that help you do a Gantt chart from a list of tasks and assign responsibilities and dependencies, timelines, and things like that. And important milestones where you're going to be doing budget reviews and reporting and stuff like that. It's enormously beneficial. Some of that can be done if you're again using planning. Some of that can be done within planning, but taking advantage of project management tools and kind of learning just some of the basic skills around that, in my experience, ends up paying huge dividends. So that's it for what I have to, that's kind of the 10 things to know before you start your budget. We're at just a little bit past the bottom of the hour, and we have scheduled an hour here. So I'd like to open this up for any questions or comments or additional thoughts that anyone might have.
I did have a question. Would you suggest, when you're talking about planning your budgeting or planning your budget cycle, would you suggest using the tasks or using features in the planning tools to help manage the cycle as
Yes,
far as, a
absolutely.
user can task list?
Yep. Yep, task lists, navigation flows and planning are great. They don't necessarily, so I highly recommend doing that, right? The more ways you can communicate to folks, making it as simple as possible, reducing the, I talked about training, but reducing the amount of training that's needed, or the additional skills that are needed. Oftentimes budget processes get bogged down just because people don't know what to do next, right? And so you send an email and things like that, and when those things add up in a large organization, you can you can talk about significant delays to the process. So I always recommend using the tools that are built in as much as possible. I really love doing custom navigation flows, right? Depending on process or whatever. Those are one of my favorite things that Oracle's ever come up with. But task lists, and then and those are great for managing sort of from an end user perspective. And I also do recommend treat this like a project, right? And even if it's just going into a simple project planning tool and putting in your high level tasks and milestones and what department's responsible for those, even just doing something like that, I think it just helps people to see where they're at, where they need to be. But yes, absolutely, anything that's built in, any additional tools that exist within the applications, absolutely use those in full benefit. Excellent question. Thanks, Jennifer. Anything else? Anyone have any other questions? Anything you've always wanted to know about budgeting and forecasting, but we're afraid to ask? I've been doing this for a long, long time.
I only have one other question, and it's around using the workflow or not task flows, but workflow where your frontline manager might do the budget and then they submit it up to their manager for review. And so I noticed in one of your slides, you said, make sure, test before you start your budget. So if someone would want to use built-in workflow. So,
Yep.
a frontline manager might build their budget and send it up. I would think that you would want to bake in some time to test the functionality of, the hierarchy of people it needs to go to, because I would think that
Yep.
that might change from year to year.
Absolutely, and that also gets into that whole idea of the the baby crabs, right? Of having too many people in the process at the same time. Those workflows can get pretty complex, and it's one of those things that I think does lacks often lacks rigorous testing, right? So a lot of organizations will implement workflow, and they'll again they may be very precise and accurate in terms of how that's set up initially, but it's one of those things that people tend to forget about. And so maybe you've got new employees, right, that have been someone left, have been, if you've had replacements or whatever, and there are new people within that workflow. Hopefully, if security was set up, it was role based, and this person has the exact same role, it's an easy replacement, but maybe their role is slightly different or whatever. And it's we often think about testing, and I didn't even slip my mind to even mention that here, right? Testing, we talk about testing your calculations and security and forms and things like that. But testing, beyond just the standard objects, testing the workflow is, it's just as important, if not more important, because more, I would say it's higher risk, right? If you've got someone at the top of the organization that has, access or not that they shouldn't or whatever, it tends to affect more of the application and more of the process, right? So yes, absolutely.
Yeah, I
If
was
you're
saying
utilizing
thinking
workflows,
testing.
test. Yep.
Yeah, testing the workflow, and then that also brought to mind like testing the consolidated results. So if you
Yep.
have many divisions in your organization and you want to make sure that the results, once they're all aggregated up, that the consolidation and elimination, if there is any, that it all vets out to.
Yeah, exactly. So again, it's when I talk about sort of the idea of preparing kind of a process in advance and doing an end-to-end walkthrough if you can or whatever. It's really to identify those types of things, right? Organizations change a lot more than people even sitting in the middle of it sometimes realize, and that there are
Right.
unintended consequences and impacts and things like that, right? So yeah, I recommend doing as much of the process as you can before doing the process live. And I know that might seem like a luxury that a lot of folks don't have, so we all have our day jobs as well, right? And it's enough of a commitment doing the budget process. But in my experience, for every hour you spend, and this is just, it's informal. I don't have a huge volume of data to back this up, but as a rule of thumb, I would say that every hour you spend preparing for the budget process probably saves you, at least double, if not triple that during the process, right? If you're the budget coordinator and you're responsible for the system and the process and everything like that, you can use as many of those hours as you can get, right? So even spending, a couple of days in advance, running through the system, running through the process within the system, getting other users involved, testing things like the workflow and looking at things at a rolled up level. Just in my experience, you'll almost always uncover something that you can probably fix in advance fairly easily. That might end up just becoming a huge, drain while you're trying to do 15 other things during the process. I always
Okay.
like to have as much time, one of the reasons I make so many of these recommendations is so that the people who are in the trenches during the budget have as much time as possible to solve problems, because you don't want to be in a position where you're solving problems that may come up, that inevitably come up, whether they be process or technology related or whatever, while you're trying to do everything else. So just having confidence in the flow of things, and the results that you're going to get up front will just make the whole everything go much more smoothly. Anything else? Anyone have any other questions or comments or thoughts? You'll still have about 20 minutes here, so we can
No,
end.
this is good. Thanks for putting this together. And then the last thing that kind of came to my mind, but it may make sense more to do like what to do as your budget's winding down,
Mhm.
is reporting, and
Yep.
where does this data kind of move to? But that might be a separate webinar.
Yeah, and I actually have delivered talks and webinars before on exactly that topic. It's usually not the top 10. It's usually more like the top five, right? It's a smaller number of recommendations or things to know, but I would say they're equally, if not more important. It's things like analyzing the process, doing root cause analysis and stuff like that. And I'd be happy to do another webinar on that as well. But maybe we'll pick a different time of the year to do that. So because as folks are tending to wind down, that might get some more attention and be more top of mind for folks. But we may also consider doing that in advance so that so people are prepared for what to do when the budget cycle's over. Okay. Well, thank you everyone for attending. I apologize for whatever technology glitch was making me cut out. Hopefully I didn't miss any content, or you didn't miss any content on the receiving end. And again, if you have any other thoughts or questions, feel free to share them with us. I'm always happy to talk about these processes and help people to make their budgeting more effective, more efficient. And my goal is always to help folks get to the beach, right? To continue using our analogy here, we want you to have enough time and work-life balance to be able to enjoy or be able to at least have the time to take some time off once in a while. And I know that's very, very difficult in FP&A groups and budgeting groups and stuff like that. There are just so many busy times of the year. My goal personally, and our goal as an organization, is to help make your process as efficient and effective as possible so you have more time to enjoy life. Thank you very much.